Hi all, Dr. Clark here, and today we're going to move from evolutionary ecology, although we'll never really move away from evolutionary ecology when we're talking about things that are ecologically related. But now we're going to talk specifically, at least for a little while, about keystone species. Okay, keystone species like this otter here are integral to the ecosystem in which they live. In other words, if you remove the keystone species, the ecosystem changes drastically. Okay? And whether you love otters or hate otters, it kind of depends on the industry that you're in. If you're a fisherman, you probably hate these guys, especially if you're a salmon fisherman and you see these guys eating salmon. But they don't eat enough salmon to do any damage to the industry. Okay, and there's been lots of research done on otters and their role in the ecosystem. Their main role and their main food source are things like sea urchins. Okay? Now, sea urchins, if you're a fan of caviar, okay, there are varieties of caviar that are urchin caviar, especially if you eat a lot of sushi and things like that. The caviar that you get on sushi is from sea urchins. And so you might not be happy with otters in that aspect. But urchins eat kelp and they eat a lot of vegetation. And otters keep the urchin population down so that the kelp forest and the kelp can expand. So you get a lot more photosynthesis in those regions, a lot more energy in those regions, and a lot more species diversity. If you remove this keystone species, what they were feeding on explodes, the kelp goes away, and basically the area dies out. Okay? And that's what we're going to talk about when we talk about keystone species. So a keystone species, again, like I said before, it plays a critical role in the community. Okay? And the critical role is more than just how abundant it is. Okay? It's really there's a lot of keystone species that are not very abundant at all, but their presence allows for the ecosystem to be stable. Okay? And the word keystone, that's really coming from like bridges. Many of you have probably driven across like an old brick bridge or even an archway. So it doesn't have to be a bridge, but the center stone, right, it's called the keystone. And the center stone, like right at the peak, is called the keystone. And if you remove that, you know what happens. Okay, the whole thing collapses. That's where the keystone species idea came from. Okay? Is that if you remove this species, the ecosystem collapses, or the community at least collapses. And there's lots of situations of this. There's animal situations, there's plant situations, there's probably things that we don't know about insect communities and other things that if they're not around, the ecosystem of the community changes drastically. Okay, another good example is figs. Figs in tropical areas, okay, they bear fruit year round, and they're one of the only plants that do so. Okay? And so if you remove this organism from the ecosystem, during the dry season, when none of the other plants are bearing fruit, there's nothing for birds and other species to eat, so the ecosystem collapses. Okay? And you might be thinking, well, why would you want to remove a fig? Well, figs can, they can take over areas, and so we didn't know this in many ecosystems, and we started removing figs, and then we started seeing that species weren't coming back, and the ecosystem was changing. The community was changing drastically. We'll talk more about situations where this might occur. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about community properties. Okay, so that's the keystone, and the keystone can fit into a lot of these. A keystone species could be the primary producer. Okay, a primary producer or primary productivity comes around typically solar energy, photosynthesis. Now, if we're talking about primary productivity in the deep ocean, okay, so deep marine environments, that's coming from chemical energy, chemosynthesis. Okay, but where there is photons, where there's light, it's coming mainly from solar energy or photons from the sun. Now, we can calculate this, and there are models, and we may do this as an assignment later. We can calculate what the primary productivity of an ecosystem is going to be. And you can calculate the net gain of energy after respiration has occurred. So after, energy that's needed to do simple processes, after that's accounted for, what's left? What's the net gain for that ecosystem? We know this much, that based on pretty much all scientific studies that we have done thus far, there are kind of three main ecosystems that are highly productivity, or has high levels of productivity. With those productivity levels comes species diversity and richness, and we'll get into this in a second. But tropical forests, which most of you know, that's where you're going to find a huge diversity of organisms, plants, animals, and all kinds of things. Okay? You go to a marine environment, okay? It's coral reefs. Okay? That's where you're going to find the majority of your fish species and invertebrates and things like that, and a lot of your plant community. Okay? And then the transition between freshwater and saltwater communities in estuaries, we also see a high level of productivity. There are also man-made areas, man-made ecosystems that are highly productive. So here's just an example of the level of productivity. So how much energy is produced per year. And so you can see that by far tropical forests, estuaries, coral reefs, these things are trumping all the other ecosystems. Okay? But intense agricultural areas are approaching the levels in some cases of how much energy is produced of these high producing areas. But keep in mind, intense agricultural areas are bringing in nutrients from outside that ecosystem through bringing in nitrogens, bringing in phosphorus, fertilizers and pesticides and things like that to increase this productivity. That's not occurring in these two ecosystems, but nonetheless, we're pretty good at getting high levels of productivity out of our agricultural systems. Okay? You can see that areas that we live in, okay, if you're watching this and you live in the western part of the United States or Wyoming, okay, most of the western part of the United States is desert area, okay, has a fairly low productivity. Okay? And we'll come back and look at some of these when we talk about biomes. So abundance and diversity. So abundance is the total number of organisms in a community, which is often referred to in a form of, you don't really care what the species are. It's just how many animals are there, or how many plants are there, and how many fungus are there, and it's just a total count. You really don't care too much about what the organisms are. Okay? Diversity is a little bit different. The diversity is how many different species are there, and how are they represented in that given area. So species diversity is two numbers. Species richness, which is how many different species are there, and then a calculation which we call species evenness. how evenly are they distributed. Okay? So that gives you a number for the diversity of an ecosystem. And we'll practice looking at some of these things just so you kind of get a feel of when we talk about, you know, tropical forests versus, say, you know, a desert environment, which one's more diverse. Okay? In some cases, they can be the exact same diversity, okay, because of, you know, that calculation of how many different species do you have and how evenly are they represented. In a tropical forest, you might have lots of different species, but it might be dominated by a few. Right? In a desert environment, you might have very few species, but they might be all equally represented. Those two numbers could be identical to each other when you calculate the diversity. And we'll do this at a later date in an assignment. Okay? So the abundance of a particular species, okay, is often related inversely, which means, okay, as it goes up, the community diversity goes down, or vice versa. Okay? So the more abundant one organism is, or a particular species is, the less diversity you have in a community. So if you go to a given area and the only species you see there is, say, you know, rabbits, okay, that's it. All you see is rabbits, and they're everywhere. Well, the community diversity in that given region is probably going to be small, okay, because you got one species that's dominating everything. Okay. So, as a general rule, diversity decreases and abundance, okay, within a species increases when moving from the equator to the poles. So, if you move from the equator towards the poles, your diversity is going to decrease. So the number of different species and how evenly paired up they are is going to decrease. But the abundance of a specific species might increase. Okay, and this will make sense to you as we progress. I'm sure we'll look at things like Bergman's rule, which goes along with this, that as you move away from the equator, in the case of mammals, mammals get bigger, right? And because they get bigger, the diversity often decreases because you can only have so many big mammals on the landscape, okay, unless you have a lot of land. But as you move away from the equator, they get bigger, okay, as you move away. But also, we'll look at the reverse of Bergman's rule, which happens to be what happens to like amphibians and reptiles and things like that. As you move closer to the equator, they get bigger. Okay, so we'll look at some of these rules that have to do with, you know, how the organism utilizes energy and things like that, and then how population dynamics works. Okay, but just as a general rule, diversity decreases as you move away from the pole, okay, and the abundance of a specific species increases. So ecological structure, okay, has to do with how are organisms spaced on the landscape. Okay, so regardless of how many species there are, regardless of, you know, how evenly they are spaced, okay, ecological structures are looking at their spatial distribution in a given region. Okay? And there are three main ways that organisms can be spaced or distributed. Okay? You can have it random. So if you look across the ecosystem, there is no rhyme or reason to where these organisms are located. That's random distribution. I'll show you a picture of it in a second. Okay, clustered or clumped. This is probably the most common distribution, and that is that organisms are distributed around a certain resource. Okay, so they might be distributed around water. They might be distributed around trees. They might be distributed around a certain plant type or a certain rock or different things. That's a clustered or a clump distribution. Okay? And most organisms, that's kind of the distribution that we find and see most often. And then there are some organisms that have a uniform distribution. Okay? And so there might be the exact spacing between all the organisms, right? And this is normally the result of competition, right? Competition for some resource. Right? The other thing that we can see, and often is forgot by a lot of individuals, including ecologists that have been studying communities for a long time, is that the distribution can also go vertical. Okay, so you can have distributions, different kinds of distributions in a water column, so a vertical water column. You can have different distributions up, say, a tree, or you can have a different distribution up a mountain. And so it doesn't have to be across a flat landscape, but it also can be vertical distributions and how organisms are distributed. Okay, so here you can see a couple examples. So these purple flowers are called lupin, and most of you guys know that pink flower is Indian paintbrush. And a lot of wildflowers, you can get this random distribution. And that should make sense to most people because wildflowers, it rains, they germinate, they explode, and produce as many seeds as possible, then they die off and they're gone. Okay? So they're not fighting for resources. There's not much competition because they don't live for very long. And so their distribution is really where do the seeds land and then what seeds are left on the landscape after insects and birds and everything like that pick off seeds and eat them. Okay? Now here you can see nesting birds. You can see these nesting birds and how they have built these little hills, okay? And I don't know if you can see this from the picture, but they're about equal distance away from each other, okay? And so they're all about the exact same distance away, and that's a uniform distribution. If you want to see this, most of you who live in the western United States, especially the southwestern United States, you've seen this before. Okay? Just go walking through the sage steppe. Okay? Go walking through sagebrush. Okay? The distance between two sagebrush is almost the exact width of your body. Okay? And so you can walk in between all the sagebrush pretty much in a lot of regions. Okay? And it's not because those are deer trail or antelope trails or anything like that. It's because there's competition between those two plants. Sagebrush pops up over here, sends out its roots, it's absorbing water, nutrients, things like that. Sagebrush pops up over here, sends out its roots, okay, and absorbing water and nutrients. If a sagebrush pops up in between them, it gets outcompeted by both these plants and dies. Okay? And that's why there's uniform spacing between sagebrush, cacti, bird nests. There's lots of situations where you kind of get these uniform distributions. And then clusters, most of you have probably seen clusters. I mean, if you're a hunter, if you hunt or if you fish or if you bird watch or enjoy the outdoors, you know that species in a lot of regions are clustered around certain ecotypes. So, there could be clustered around a single water source. Okay? If we're looking at coral reef fish, they're clustered around a certain type of coral reef or certain type of coral. Okay? And that's normally clustered around some kind of resource, either water, food, mates, shelter, something like that. Okay? All right, so complexity, when in regards to an ecosystem, is normally, when we talk about complexity, we're talking about the number of trophic levels. So the number of species in each trophic level or the number of levels that are represented. Okay? And so we often think, well, an ecosystem has to be considered complex if it has a great number of trophic levels. Okay? And that may or may not be true. It really depends on the ecosystem, because sometimes ecosystems just have a few trophic levels, but they're represented by equal numbers of species, and that can make that ecosystem very complex. In other cases, you might have a ton of trophic levels and a few different species in each one. Okay? And so it really depends on the ecosystem, and so diverse communities may not be complex, okay? Because all the species could be clustered in just a couple trophic levels. And communities that we would consider not very diverse, so there's not very many species, could be considered complex because they have equal representation across all trophic levels. And then, you can have this interconnected communities, okay, and you can have trophic levels that are tightly connected. And this is kind of like the first example that I gave you with otters. Okay? And so otters might represent the keystone species, but it also represents this interconnected community. If you get a change in one part of the trophic level, you can change another trophic level very quickly. And so other times, though, it doesn't matter what you do to one of the levels of the trophic level. There's a compartmentalization at a trophic level, and it really does nothing to it. And we'll look at some of these examples, more examples, later when we start analyzing ecosystems. Okay. So, here's an example. Most people know that the tropical rainforests on our planet are extremely diverse. Okay? Probably at least 50%, if not, closer to 75% of all the terrestrial species live in the tropical rainforest. Okay? So all of the terrestrial species that we've named, about 50 to 75%, okay, live in the tropical rainforest. So it's hugely diverse. But part of that diversity really comes with complexity. Because if you're looking at this ecosystem, you can tell that you got these, lower story plants that are going to have one ecological niche, and then mid-story plants that have another ecological niche, and then, sub-high plants that have another one, and then these tall plants. And so you get all these ecological niches within the same environment. And so this goes back to what we were talking about when we were talking about MacArthur's work on resource partitioning, and Goss's work on no species can occupy the same niche. Okay, this is a great example of that. When you have an area that has a huge number of ecological niches, that makes it very complex, but also gives it the capability of being very diverse. Okay, let's talk about resilience and stability. So back to MacArthur, Robert MacArthur. Remember I talked about him, died at the age of like 42, really young, but came up with lots of different concepts that we know in ecology that have really driven our understandings of ecosystems, so island biogeography, community support, community competition, resource partitioning, lots of different things. Well, MacArthur also proposed that complex, interconnected communities are going to be more stable and resilient in the face of disturbance. So if you're looking at something like a rainforest, it's complex, interconnected, okay? That small changes like a wildfire that runs through, or like a disease outbreak that runs through, or a logging operation that runs through, these ecosystems are going to be much more resilient and stable when these disturbances occur. Okay? Now, some studies have supported this, okay? And so I'm not going to buy into all these ecosystems that we would consider complex and ecologically rich have these capabilities. Okay. So some studies have supported this idea while others have not. And a lot of it really has to do with what's the disturbance and what's the effect on the keystone species. Okay? So you might have a very interconnected, complex community, but again, if you remove the keystone species or you um, destroy the interconnectedness between the keystone species and the other group, you could have an ecological collapse. All right, this kind of brings me to another concept in ecology that's important when we talk about management, resource management, when we talk about, taking timber, or when we talk about plowing fields, or when we talk about digging coal pits, or putting in, solar panels, or putting in a wind farm, or things like that. We need to think about the importance of different types of habitat, but also aspects of that habitat. One being the edge effect. So the edge effect is the edge between one type of habitat and another type of habitat. And we'll often find that organisms transcend that boundary. So lots of organisms live on the boundary, the edge between one habitat and another habitat, because they can utilize both habitats. And this brings us kind of to what we call ecotones. Okay? So these are the areas or the boundaries between adjacent communities. Now, if you have a sharp boundary, okay, you might have close communities. I mean, if you have a sharp boundary in which you have a forest, and then outside of that forest it's been clear cut and it's grassland, you probably have closed communities, grassland species, forested species. Okay? If the boundary is somewhat indistinguishable, so it's not quite distinct, and so you might have a trickle effect. You might have forest and then a few trees that are trickling out into the grasslands. Now you can have open communities. Now you can have organisms that transcend that boundary area. Okay? And so when we talk about edge effects and ecotones, mainly we're talking about this from the destructive habitats that humans often destroy land for our purpose, right? Whether that be to grow more food, for more energy, for a road, for just financial gains, whatever it might be. And that's always going to be the fact. We're always going to do this because we have to. In many situations, we have to do that in order to support the 7.7 billion people we have on the planet. You have to be able to take natural resources. But a wise way of taking natural resources is to do things to maintain the ecotones so that the communities are open. For example, you have two ecotones here, maybe even three ecotones. You have this aquatic environment, right, where you're going to have organisms that might be feeding here, they might be drinking here, etc. But you can see this is that ecotone that's making this kind of open. So this is not a completely closed ecotone because you have this forested habitat, at least a few trees, a few shelter trees next to the water source. You have this open grassland, but again, you still have some of these trees that are in this region. Okay? And then you have this, forested habitat. By having these stationary objects, I mean, yes, we could always plow this under. We could cut all these trees and we could just make this one giant field of alfalfa or whatever it might be. It doesn't really matter. We could do that. We could remove these trees next to the river and we could just build alfalfa fields all the way up to the water source. Okay? By doing that, though, you're making this a closed system. The forested organisms that live in the forest are now closed off from the water ecosystem. Okay? So you could have alfalfa here. okay, interdispersed with the trees. Okay? And so you could have organisms that could still seek shelter in these trees. Now, we don't like to do that, and I understand why I don't like to do that. So I didn't grow up, but I have a background in kind of farming because I've spent a lot of time on farms in North Dakota and South Dakota and stuff. I know what it's like to drive a combine around trees. It's not possible. Okay, I mean it is possible, but you miss a lot, and that's why these trees would have to be removed if you're going to make this a field. Okay, but being more wise in which we can leave some of this habitat will allow those systems to be connected. Okay? And so this really kind of brings us to the edge effect also. So you might say, well, look at this corridor. Look at this amount of land, okay? It's widespread, and the organisms should be able to move, okay? But it depends on the organism, and it depends on what the organism needs. If the organism needs a core area, a reserve, okay, an area where they can escape the edge effect, then you need to have a area, in which they can do that. And different organisms need to be able to do that. Now, other organisms might thrive with something like this, where you have a corridor between one habitat to the next, and in between, you might have cropland here and here or something like that, so they can still make it around the cropland and they don't have to travel through the open spaces versus just one dot on the map. Now, some organisms, they need this dot on the map. They need this core area where it's undisturbed and there's no edge so they can escape predators. Others, like the predators, really like this kind of habitat where they can move through. Okay? Now that brings us to a point that is really going on in Wyoming right now with wildfires and things like that, is what we call ecological succession. Okay? So there are examples of ecological succession, and there are steps to ecological succession. There's primary, secondary, tertiary, but or final climax communities. Okay, but primary succession is when new pioneer species occupy an area that is not colonized. Okay? It can be not colonized for multiple reasons. You could have a lava flow that just creates new area, okay? But it also could be that you have an area that is like a wildfire that comes through and burns everything, and then it's so hot that it basically sterilizes the soil. So the only seeds that are going to take are pioneer species that are coming from outside that ecosystem. Okay? And that's probably what's going on with a lot of the fires that happen in California. Some of the fires that are happening in the West, they're so hot and they're so big that a lot of the species that occur on that landscape, they're completely gone, and it really has to start all over. Okay? Secondary succession is when you have new species that take over the primary succession or the primary species. So pioneers come in, they establish, they make the nutrients, and the soils are much more rich because they die. Most of these guys are annuals, so they bloom and die and then bloom and die, and the soils become much more rich, and then new species can come and get established and take over those regions, so the pioneer species are no longer in existence. And then you can get what we call climax communities, and so this is where, really these species that occur in climax communities are going to be there for a long time, okay? And they will outcompete all the other species. So here's just an example of that. So you might have exposed rocks, okay, just basic, rock, new rock, this probably coming from a volcano, okay? Your first pioneer species would be things like lichens, mosses that can come in. Lichens are a combination of, algae and a fungus, okay? And they have the capability of breaking down rocks. So they have the capability of dissolving rock. and they're going to do that, and they're going to make the soils more rich, so things like grasses and annuals and things like that can come in, get established in between these rocks because the soils are going to be more rich. And then over time, you get pioneer tree species, things like aspens and things like that grow really fast, and then they're going to be replaced by things that grow very slow but get very large, like spruces and stuff like that. And that's the climax community. All right, so those disturbances, it's really any force that can disrupt the normal species diversity, normal abundance in a given region. Okay, storms like hurricanes, fires, tornadoes, logging events, plowing of a field, lots of different things can disturb the species and typically disturb the community properties that's going on in that environment. Okay. Now, most of the time, a disturbance that is severe enough that the species diversity changes or the community changes is going to disrupt the major competitors on that ecosystem. So you might be removing the keystone species, or you might be removing one of the top predators. Okay? So there's less competition of species below, and you can get a whole ecosystem change. The other thing is I showed you the progression from primary succession, secondary, and then climax. Some ecosystems will never make it to climax communities because disturbances happen so frequently. This was probably the case in ecosystems in the West prior to man coming to the western part of the United States and putting out fires and doing fire suppression. This ecosystem used to burn a lot, and so we probably, especially in places like Wyoming, we probably didn't have very many climax communities. Maybe in the Wind River Mountains or the Uintas and things like that, but outside of that, there's probably not very many climax communities because wildfires would burn the entire ecosystem and it'd have to start over. Okay? It didn't have to start over from scratch like a lot of the wildfires are doing to ecosystems today, but they had to start over at the grasses coming up. The trees were all gone. The grasses would have to come up. The sapling trees from aspens and things like that would come back, and you'd have to start over. And then 10, 15, 20 years later, it all burned down again, and you'd have to start over. And so we have this cycle of every 10, 20 years, you'd have fires that rip through the ecosystem, burn it down. So you really would never make that climax community. All right, so I really want to stop with introduced species, and we'll come back and we'll talk a lot about these examples, but introduced species can really change an ecosystem. Okay? Introduced species can remove the keystone themselves, but it also can just disrupt the pattern, disrupt the ecosystem and its players. We've seen this in many ecosystems with the introduction of rats and cats and goats, pigs, rabbits, on different islands, and just massive disturbances where there's really nothing left on the island except for what it was introduced. We've also done this ourselves. Okay? We've done this by introducing exotic species to solve a problem. But hopefully these days are over. Hopefully the non-ecologically minded individuals making these decisions are out, and they literally take ecologists' advice before they introduce things. For example, okay, mongoose was introduced to tropical islands to get rid of rats, rats that occur in sugarcane. And the idea was that this would work because it had worked in South America. Right? And so mongoose that occur in South America, they kill rats, they eat rats, and they don't have a rat problem. So in places, Hawaiian Islands, Okay, the idea was the same. Hey, we got sugarcane fields. There's rats all over in the sugarcane fields. Let's introduce mongoose. Okay? The problem is these guys are diurnal. Okay, these guys are out during the day, hunting during the day. The rats that were occurring in the sugarcane fields in the Hawaiian Islands are nocturnal. The mongoose never even saw the rat. Okay? And so now they have an issue with mongoose because mongoose is going to find something to eat. It was supposed to be eating the rats, but now it's eating native animals, the native birds and things like that. And so now people hate the mongoose and they want to kill the mongoose. This is the same trend that happened with the cane toad. Okay? Cane, sugarcane. The sugarcane industry is notorious for some really bad introductions. Okay? There's a cane beetle in Australia. Okay? It eats sugarcane. So there's a cane toad in South America, okay, that eats cane beetles. Different type of cane beetle. Okay? But people who were making these decisions didn't know that. So they took cane toads from South America and they introduced them to Australia. Well, the cane toad really wasn't interested in that cane beetle, and so it decided to eat all the native fish and all the other native amphibians. On top of that, it's toxic, it's poisonous, and so it kills dogs, and it's just a huge issue. And there's lots of examples of introductions gone very wrong, and changing ecosystems drastically. So with that, the next thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about biomes. So we're going to talk about how we categorize ecosystems on the planet, and then we'll move into kind of extracting resources from these ecosystems, the benefits, the costs, the economics behind it, the social properties behind it, okay, and how it's kind of done, and who benefits, who loses. Okay? Till next time.